Have you ever wondered why avoidants seem to vanish the moment things start to feel real? One day, they're leaning in just enough to give you hope. The next, it's as if you never existed. It feels confusing, even cruel. But the truth is, avoidance is rarely about you. It's about a survival system they've carried since childhood. That's why today, on Dear Avoidant, we're diving deep into a question that has puzzled so many people who love avoidance. What makes them finally stop avoiding and face love? To really understand this, we need to look beneath the surface, beyond the behaviors that frustrate and hurt, into the psychological wiring of an avoidant heart. Avoidants aren't heartless. They're not cold machines incapable of love, even though it can feel that way when they pull back right after you've shared something intimate. What they are, in reality, is people who learned very early that closeness can be unsafe. For some, maybe a parent was inconsistent, warm one day, withdrawn the next. For others, maybe their needs were ignored, or worse, shamed. Over time, their nervous system decided, if I rely on others, I get hurt. If I need too much, I'll be rejected. Better to stand on my own. That's the silent vow avoidants carry into adult relationships. And unless something interrupts that cycle, they keep running, again and again. But here's where it gets fascinating. Avoidants don't actually want to be alone. Deep down, they crave love just like anyone else. They feel longing. They notice the emptiness when you stop chasing them. They regret when a connection slips away, even if they never say it out loud. This paradox, wanting love but fearing it, is what makes them so complex. And it's also the reason why, under the right conditions, they can finally stop avoiding and start facing love. So, what are those conditions? What makes the armor crack? Let me share a story. A woman I once coached, we'll call her Maya, had been in a long, painful cycle with her dismissive avoidant partner. Whenever she got close, he would retreat. Whenever she demanded answers, he shut down. She kept pushing, thinking more explanation, more pressure would get through to him. But it never did. Then one day, she stopped explaining. She stopped pleading. Instead, she quietly began living her own life. She set boundaries, not as punishment, but as self-respect. And slowly, something remarkable happened. He noticed. He came closer, not because she demanded it, but because he felt the loss of her emotional presence. That absence forced him to confront what he was truly afraid of losing. And this is one of the first keys we'll explore. Avoidants often face love when they realize they can no longer hide behind distance. When silence is no longer met with pursuit, when their space doesn't protect them but instead isolates them, they begin to feel the cost of avoidance. That cost, sometimes, is greater than the fear of intimacy. But before we get too far ahead, let's ground ourselves in the psychology of avoidance. Neuroscience shows us that avoidants operate from a heightened sensitivity to shame. They're not avoiding you because they don't care. They're avoiding because your closeness lights up the part of them that whispers, I'm not enough. If you see too much of me, you'll leave. Every step forward feels like exposure. Every intimate moment feels like a risk of rejection. So they retreat, not to hurt you, but to protect themselves from a pain they've carried for decades. And yet, life has a way of pressing on those wounds until they can't be ignored. For some avoidants, it's the quiet ache of loneliness. For others, it's the recognition that they've lost good people, again and again, all because they pushed them away. That recognition can spark something new, a crack in the old armor, a willingness, however small, to face what they've been running from. This is where our journey begins today. Not with judgment of avoidance, not with frustration about why they do what they do, but with compassion and curiosity. Because if you can understand the inner logic of avoidance, you'll see that their distance isn't rejection of you, It's protection of them. And when you shift the way you respond, you create the exact space where they can. Finally, stop avoiding and start facing love. When avoidants begin to sense the cost of their distance, the shift doesn't happen all at once. It's not like they wake up one day and say, "Okay, I'm ready for intimacy now." Instead, it unfolds slowly, in layers, almost like watching winter thaw into spring. At first, you might notice subtle changes. They initiate a text instead of waiting for you to reach out. They stay a little longer in conversation, rather than escaping at the first sign of vulnerability. They ask questions about your day, not because they feel obligated, but because they genuinely want to bridge the gap. These small signs are often the very first indicators that something deeper is stirring inside them. But what actually makes that stirring happen? From my years studying and observing avoidant dynamics, I've noticed three main triggers that often set the stage for avoidants to finally face love. The first is the experience of true emotional safety. When they realize that being vulnerable doesn't immediately lead to criticism, demands, or abandonment, they begin to rewire old assumptions. Imagine an avoidant man who grew up with a parent who dismissed every tear or punished every need. His nervous system learned, if I show emotion, I'll be hurt. But when he finds himself with a partner who listens calmly, validates his feelings, and doesn't rush to fix him or overwhelm him, it's as if his entire body says, "Wait, this is different. Maybe it's safe here." The second trigger is loss. As painful as it is to admit, avoidants often only recognize the depth of their feelings when someone they care about steps back or walks away. This isn't about playing games or trying to manipulate them into chasing. It's about the natural consequence of distance. When the person who once gave energy, love, and presence is suddenly absent, the avoidant is forced to confront the emptiness that remains. That silence is louder than any words. It awakens a realization. I pushed away something I actually needed. And in that recognition, the walls can start to crumble. The third trigger is personal growth. Moments when the avoidant themselves decides to stop running. This could come through therapy, a life crisis, or even simple self-reflection. I've heard countless stories of avoidants who hit a breaking point after repeating the same cycle of failed relationships. They finally see the pattern, pulling away, regretting, longing, and repeating. At some point, the pain of loneliness outweighs the fear of closeness. And in that moment, they make a choice, however fragile, to try something different. Let me share another story to bring this to life. A man I once worked with, we'll call him David, had been married twice, both marriages ending because he pulled away whenever things got too intimate. Each time he told himself he just wasn't built for relationships. But deep down, he longed for connection. After his second divorce, he started therapy. Slowly, painfully, he began to see that the problem wasn't that he didn't care. It was that caring felt unbearable because it exposed his deepest wound, the fear of being unworthy. For the first time in his life, he didn't run from that realization. He sat with it. And that sitting, painful as it was, became the turning point. Eventually, he entered a new relationship, and while it wasn't perfect, it was different. He leaned in instead of shutting down. He apologized instead of withdrawing. He began to face love rather than avoid it. And here's the piece I want you to take in. Avoidants are not hopeless. They're not destined to run forever. But the conditions that allow them to stop avoiding and face love are rarely about someone chasing them harder, arguing louder, or proving their worth endlessly. It's about a combination of safety, consequence, and personal choice. It's about creating an emotional climate where their walls feel unnecessary, where the silence is too heavy to ignore, and where they finally decide their fear is no longer worth the cost of love lost. As we continue, I want you to hold on to this idea. Facing love for an avoidant is not an event. It's a process. It unfolds slowly, often invisibly, until one day you notice something has shifted. And when it does, it's not because they became someone else overnight. It's because they finally allowed themselves to meet the part of them they've been running from all along. One of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant attachment is that people think avoidants don't care. They assume detachment equals coldness, that silence equals indifference. But if you've ever been close to an avoidant, you know that's not the full story. Avoidants feel just as deeply as anyone else, sometimes even more intensely. The difference is that they're not equipped to process what they feel in real time. Their coping mechanism is distance. When emotions overwhelm them, they shut down, intellectualize, or retreat into solitude because that's what feels safe. But here's the paradox. In trying to protect themselves from emotional pain, they also block themselves from emotional connection, the very thing they crave most. This is where the anxious partner often gets caught in the crossfire. Anxiously attached individuals tend to experience relationships through the lens of closeness, reassurance, and constant connection. To them, love is proven through availability. So, when the avoidant pulls away, the anxious instinct is to close the gap. They text more, they ask questions, they push for clarity, they try to fix. Not out of manipulation, but out of fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of losing the bond they've invested so much in. And from the avoidance perspective, this intensified pursuit feels suffocating, like their independence is being threatened. So, they push back harder, retreating even further. This is the anxious avoidant dance, a cycle of pursuit and retreat that leaves both people feeling misunderstood, unloved, and exhausted. What's fascinating, though, is what happens after the breakup. When the anxious finally stops chasing, the avoidant is left with silence. At first, they may feel relieved. The constant texts are gone. The pressure lifted. The sense of being monitored disappears. But that relief rarely lasts. Slowly, the absence of contact creates space. And in that space, the avoidant's delayed emotions begin to catch up with them. They start replaying old conversations, remembering small details they once dismissed, scrolling through pictures they claimed they didn't care about. The very intensity that once felt overwhelming now begins to feel like a loss. This is what I often call the emotional boomerang. Avoidants throw away connection to protect themselves. But when the emotional dust settles, the reality of what they've lost begins to hit them. I've seen this play out in countless stories, but one that always stands out is from a woman I'll call Sarah. She was in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant partner for nearly 3 years. Throughout that time, she was the one doing the emotional labor, initiating conversations, planning dates, checking in on his feelings, apologizing for conflicts she didn't start. Eventually, exhausted and heartbroken, she stopped. She didn't make a dramatic exit. She simply pulled her energy back. No more chasing, no more begging for attention. At first, her partner seemed fine. He even told friends he was relieved. But months later, Sarah began receiving late-night messages. "I miss you. I've been thinking about us. I didn't realize what I had until you were gone." What had changed? Nothing external. What shifted was that the silence gave his nervous system no more distractions. For the first time, he had to face the weight of what he had lost. Now, I don't share this story to say that every avoidant will come back, or that you should wait around hoping they do. In fact, one of the most important things for the anxious partner to learn is that their healing doesn't depend on whether the avoidant regrets or returns. But these stories reveal something crucial. Avoidants are not immune to love. They're not incapable of missing someone. They simply process on a delayed timeline. When the anxious is still in pursuit, the avoidant feels in control. They know they can push and still be caught. But when the anxious truly lets go, when the dynamic is no longer sustained, the avoidant loses that safety net. And in that loss, they discover something they never allowed themselves to admit. Connection mattered more than they were willing to acknowledge. This delayed recognition also explains why avoidants often cycle back into past relationships. They might not say, "I want to get back together," but they'll test the waters, liking an old photo, sending a casual, "Hey, how have you been?" or bringing up shared memories. These small gestures aren't random. They're attempts to reattach, to fill the void that silence left behind. But here's the critical part. This doesn't necessarily mean they've changed. Missing someone and being ready for intimacy are two different things. The former is about regret. The latter is about growth. And unless the avoidant has done the work through self-reflection, therapy, or conscious effort, falling back into the same cycle is almost guaranteed. So, what do we take away from this? First, if you've been the anxious partner, recognize that your love wasn't wasted. The care, attention, and emotional depth you brought into that relationship left an imprint, even if it wasn't fully appreciated at the time. Second, understand that avoidance missing you isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their process. And third, remember that you're not responsible for their healing. Their journey to face love is theirs to walk. Yours is to reclaim your self-worth, to recognize that real intimacy requires reciprocity, and to stop giving energy to dynamics that drain you. In the end, avoidants don't stop avoiding because someone convinces them to. They stop when silence forces them to feel, when loss forces them to reflect, and when they finally decide that running isn't worth the emptiness it creates, and that truth, painful, liberating, and deeply human, is what makes this cycle so universal. There's something almost ironic about avoidant attachment. The very thing they fear, closeness, is also the very thing they end up missing once it's gone. This isn't because avoidants are manipulative or cruel. It's because their nervous system has been conditioned to equate intimacy with danger. Many avoidants grew up in environments where emotional needs weren't met, where independence was praised but vulnerability was punished. So as adults, their instinct is to build walls, not because they don't want love, but because they were never taught that love could be safe. When you look at avoidant behavior through this lens, it changes everything. That cold silence after a breakup isn't proof that they didn't care. It's proof that they don't know how to process caring in real time. That delayed regret isn't manipulation. It's the slow unraveling of defenses that have been there for decades. And as frustrating as this is for their partners, it also explains why so many avoidants eventually circle back to past relationships. Once the noise of pursuit is gone, once the anxious partner stops holding the rope, the avoidant is left with nothing but their own reflection. And that reflection is often unbearable. Here's where the story shifts from psychology into philosophy. Because what avoidants ultimately discover in these moments of silence is that independence without connection is hollow. Yes, freedom feels good when you're overwhelmed. Space feels safe when your heart is racing. But when the dust settles, when the quiet stretches on for weeks or months, the so-called freedom begins to feel like exile. Human beings are wired for attachment. Even avoidants who spend their lives running from it cannot outrun biology. Their bodies crave the very closeness their minds reject. And when that craving collides with the reality of loss, regret becomes inevitable. I want to share an example that illustrates this. A man I'll call Daniel ended a long-term relationship with his anxious partner because he felt smothered. For months after the breakup, he insisted to everyone around him that he was better off alone. He threw himself into work, hobbies, and casual dating. But 6 months later, He admitted to a friend that he couldn't stop thinking about his ex. He wasn't remembering the fights or the moments of tension. He was remembering the way she left coffee on his desk when he worked late, the way she texted just to ask how he was doing, the way she noticed things no one else did. At the time, those gestures felt overwhelming. In hindsight, they felt irreplaceable. This is the emotional time lag of the avoidant mind. What feels like suffocation in the moment often feels like safety in retrospect. And yet, here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Regret doesn't always lead to change. An avoidant missing you doesn't mean they're ready to love you differently. It doesn't mean they've suddenly learned how to sit with intimacy. Often, it just means they're aware of the void you left behind. That's why so many anxious partners get caught in the cycle of reunion and heartbreak. The avoidant comes back, not because they've transformed, but because they crave the familiar comfort they once rejected. Without self-awareness and growth, the cycle repeats. Push, pull, silence, regret, over and over again. So what does this mean for you, especially if you've loved an avoidant? It means you need to anchor yourself in reality, not hope. Their regret doesn't validate your worth. You already had worth, whether they saw it or not. Their missing you doesn't mean you should step back into the same dynamic. Healing for you means recognizing that love isn't proven by how much you're willing to endure. It's proven by reciprocity, by shared effort, by emotional presence. And if that's not what you were getting, then your path isn't about waiting for them to change. It's about choosing yourself. Because here's the paradox that sets you free. The more you step into your own healing, the more likely it is that the avoidant will feel the weight of what they lost. Not because you manipulated them, not because you chased them, but because absence speaks louder than presence. When you stop pouring your energy into proving your love, the silence forces them to confront what they could no longer deny. That love was never the threat. Their fear was. And that's the part they have to face alone. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's this. Avoidants do feel. They do care. And yes, sometimes they do regret. But their regret is not your responsibility to manage. Too many people stay trapped in the hope that if they just love harder, wait longer, or sacrifice more, the avoidant will finally wake up and love them the way they deserve. The truth is, awakening doesn't come from being pursued. It comes from being left to face the silence. And that's why your healing matters more than their return. You see, when you step out of the anxious avoidant cycle, when you reclaim your energy, your voice, your boundaries, you shift the dynamic completely. You are no longer waiting for scraps of attention. You are no longer interpreting silence as strength. You're choosing to believe that real intimacy is possible, and that you're worthy of it. Here's something I've learned. People don't always remember the exact words you said, but they will always remember how they felt in your presence. If you loved deeply, if you gave with sincerity, then your love left an imprint. Whether or not the avoidant ever admits it, they will carry that imprint with them. Not because you weren't enough, but because you were real in a way they weren't ready to handle. And maybe one day they'll come back, maybe they won't. But by then, the question won't be, do they regret losing me? It will be, do I still want to be the person who waits for someone else to grow? That's the real power shift. Because healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means rewriting your future. So if you've ever found yourself in love with someone who pushed you away, hear this. Your love was not wasted. It was a mirror they weren't ready to look into. It was a gift they couldn't hold. And it was a chapter in their story that they'll revisit in the quiet moments, even if they never tell you. But your story, your healing, your growth, your freedom, that's just beginning. Because love isn't about chasing someone who runs. Love is about standing still in your truth, knowing that the right person won't see your presence as pressure, but as peace. And that's the kind of love you deserve. So let them regret. Let them miss you. Let them come to their realizations in their own time. But don't lose yourself in the waiting. The most powerful thing you can do is to keep moving forward. Because the love you gave wasn't wasted. It's a part of you. And when you finally give it to someone who can hold it with both hands, that's when everything changes.